She had learned, very early in life, that the safest place to stand was the edge of a room. Not the corner, where people might notice you hiding. Not the center, where people expected you to perform. The edge, close enough to witness everything, invisible enough to be forgotten before the night was over. Rhea had perfected this art over 31 years of living inside the Iron Veil Pack's grand archive, and she wore her invisibility the way other women wore fine gowns. Deliberately, carefully, as both shield and armor. So when the great doors of Kaelin's throne hall swung open and the herald announced the arrival of the Iron Veil delegation, Rhea did what she always did. She stepped back. She let Alpha Dorian stride forward with his chest high and his shoulders squared, let his 2 lieutenants flank him with their ceremonial blades, and she fell 3 steps behind, her satchel of records pressed to her side, her eyes fixed on the carved stone floor, as if the patterns there were the most fascinating thing in the entire kingdom. She was the Pack's archivist, their scribe, their keeper of records. She was here to document the Grand Assembly of the Iron Moon, not to be documented herself. That was fine. That was exactly how she preferred things. The throne hall of the Iron Crown was everything the texts had promised and more. Rhea had read descriptions of it in at least 40 separate historical accounts, cross-referenced the architectural measurements with the original builder's notes, and still nothing fully prepared her for the scale of the place. The ceiling soared 3 stories above, supported by columns of black granite veined with silver ore that caught the torchlight and scattered it like stars. The floor was a single slab of polished obsidian, so dark and so perfectly smooth that walking across it felt like walking across frozen water. Banners hung from every column, deep charcoal with silver wolves mid-howl, and between them, the flags of every allied pack that had answered the king's summons. She counted 17 sets as she walked. She could not help herself. Counting was something her hands and mind did automatically when the rest of her was occupied with not being seen. There were perhaps 200 people in the hall already, alphas and their seconds and their favored courtiers, all arranged in loose clusters that communicated more about political alliance than any formal seating chart ever could. Rhea cataloged them in quick glances as she moved along the edge of the room toward the scribe's table, which had been set to the far right of the king's dais, partially screened by a tall carved partition. Perfect. She would have sightlines to everything and would be visible to almost no one. She was already composing the opening paragraph of her assembly record in her head, the formal date notation, the weather, the attendance count, the precise temperature of political tension in the room as measured by who was speaking, to whom and who was pointedly not. She did not see him at first. That was the thing she would return to later, in the quiet hours of the night, when the memory replayed itself with the insistence of something that wanted to be fully understood. She did not see Aldrich before he saw her, or before whatever happened, because calling it seeing did not feel accurate. What Aldrich did when Rhea crossed the center of the throne hall was not simply a matter of eyes tracking movement. It was something older than sight. He was standing near the king's dais, which was itself remarkable because no one stood near the king's dais without an explicit invitation. He was tall in the way that certain very old trees are tall, not aggressively, not as a display, but simply as an unignorable fact of their existence. His hair was the silver gray of winter frost, worn loose to his jaw, and his face held the particular stillness of someone who had long since stopped needing to arrange their expressions for other people's comfort. He wore no ceremonial armor, only a dark tunic, and a single pauldron on his left shoulder, bearing a wolf's head sigil that Rhea recognized with a small internal shock. The sigil of the First. It was not supposed to exist outside of written records. She had seen it in manuscripts dated to the founding era, nearly 2 centuries past, and had always assumed the artifact itself had been lost. But it was there on his shoulder, worn as casually as a man might. Wear a button. Aldrich the Grey. She had read about him too. Everyone had read about him. He was the oldest living wolf in the 7 territories, a warrior who had served 3 kings before Kaelin and bent his knee to none of them. a figure of such established legend that most younger wolves were never entirely sure he was real, rather than a story told to make the history of the packs feel more dramatic. He was real. He was very, very real. And he was looking at her. She noticed the looking first. As an anomaly. Someone's gaze had weight. More weight than the ambient awareness of a crowded room. And it landed on her with a precision that made the small hairs on the back of her neck rise. She turned her head. A reflex, expecting to find that she had wandered into someone's direct path and needed to step aside. Instead, she found Aldrich's gray eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not immediately name. Not curiosity. Not recognition, exactly. Something beneath both of those things. Something that seemed to be consulting a very deep and very old memory. She looked away. She looked back at the floor and kept walking. Because whatever was happening, it was not her business. And she was here to write. Not to be stared at by ancient warriors who should have had considerably more interesting things to occupy their attention. She had taken perhaps 4 more steps when she heard the sound. Not a sound, exactly. More like the absence of sound. The hall had been filled with the low, continuous murmur of 200 voices in varying states of formal politeness, and then that murmur simply stopped, the way a stream stops when something enormous steps into it. Rhea stopped too. She turned around, because she was constitutionally incapable of not investigating a sudden and total silence. It was practically a professional hazard for someone whose entire life was built around noticing things that others missed. Aldrich was on one knee. The first thought her mind produced was, completely useless. She thought, his tunic will get dusty. The obsidian floor was perfectly clean. She had noted that. But her mind apparently needed somewhere to go that was not the enormity of what she was witnessing. And so it went there, to the practical matter of dust on dark fabric, while the rest of her slowly comprehended the impossible thing in front of her. Aldrich the Grey, the wolf who had never knelt, not for kings, not for councils, not for any authority in 200 years of living, was on one knee on the throne hall floor. His silver head was bowed. His right fist was pressed to his chest in the old salute, the one that appeared in the founding-era manuscripts, the one that predated the current pack hierarchy by at least a century, the one that meant, in the language of those old records, that a warrior was acknowledging something that outranked even a king. And he was facing her. Rhea stood very still. Her satchel hung from her fingers. Somewhere in the hall, she heard someone draw a sharp breath, and then the silence became the particular silence of a room in which everyone has simultaneously decided not to be the first to speak. "You should not be a scribe," Aldrich said. His voice was quiet, low, the kind of voice that did not need volume to reach every corner of a room. It reached every corner anyway. "You should never have been a scribe." Rhea said nothing. She was fairly certain that if she opened her mouth, something entirely undignified would come. Out of it. He rose then, the way old mountains rise, without hurry and without particular effort, and he looked at her with those winter-gray eyes, and said nothing further. He simply looked, and then he turned back toward the dais, and the hall began to breathe again, in a ragged collective exhale that rippled through every cluster of 200 people like a wave. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this. 1. Rhea made it to the scribe's table. She sat down. She opened her satchel with hands that were entirely steady, because she had learned long ago that the body could be commanded even when the mind was in chaos, and she laid out her materials with their usual precision. Ink, quill, record parchment, the day's date, the assembly number. She wrote the opening line of the record, the formal notation, and her handwriting was as clean and controlled as it always was. Then she set down the quill, folded her hands in her lap, and stared at the partition for a long moment, because she needed somewhere to put her eyes that was not the dais, where she could feel, without looking, that someone was watching her. She knew, without looking, exactly who it was. King Kaelin of the Iron Crown had ruled for 11 years, which Rhea knew because she had archived the records of his coronation, the formal proceedings, the witness accounts, the genealogical documentation of his ascension. She knew his lineage better than most members of his own court. She knew the names of his grandparents and their parents before them, the alliances they had forged and broken, the bloodlines that had folded into his through marriage and conquest, and the occasional careful arrangement that the official records described diplomatically as a union of mutual interest. She knew all of this, and had never, in 4 years of attending assemblies as Ironvale's scribe, actually looked at him with any particular attention. This was, she realized, a significant professional oversight. Kaelin was not what she would have expected from the records. The records described him in the formal language of official documentation. Alpha of the Iron Crown, Lord of the 7 Territories, ruler of sound judgment and firm governance. The records did not describe the way he occupied space, which was less like a man standing in a room, and more like a room organizing itself around a man. He was perhaps 10 years older than her, somewhere in his early 40s, with dark hair that had gone silver at the temples, and a face that managed to be both intensely watchful and entirely still. The face of someone who was always thinking several moves ahead of whatever was currently happening, and had become so accustomed to this that they no longer bothered to hide it. His eyes were the amber gold of deep autumn, the color of old honey, the color of something that held light rather than reflected it, and they were fixed on Rhea with an expression she recognized, because she had just recently seen a variation of it on Aldrich's face. She looked away first. She always looked away first. It was a habit she had developed into an art form. Alpha Dorian appeared at her side, crouching low so his voice would not carry, and his face held the particular mix of bewilderment and carefully controlled alarm that characterized a man who has just watched something happen that he did not understand and was not sure how to categorize. "Rhea," he said, and stopped. Started again. "What was that?" "I do not know," she said, which was entirely true. "Aldrich the Grey bowed to you." "I am aware. He has never bowed to anyone." "I have read the records, yes." Dorian stared at her for a moment, with the expression of a man who wanted very much to ask a follow-up question and could not identify which one to ask first. Then he straightened, smoothed the front of his ceremonial jacket, and said, "Stay close to the table. Do not engage with anyone from the Crown Court unless I am present." He paused. "Do you understand what I am saying to you? You are saying that something has shifted in the room and you do not yet know what it means, but you want me contained until you do," Rhea said. Dorian looked at her, and for a moment, something moved behind his eyes that was almost guilty. "I am saying to be careful," he said, and moved away. She picked up her quill again and wrote 2 more lines of the opening record. The torchlight was excellent, steady and warm. The hall had returned to something resembling its previous ambient noise level, though with a different quality now, sharper, more aware of itself, like a conversation that has had an unexpected word dropped into it, and has not yet decided what to do with that word. She could hear fragments of it from her position behind the partition. "Did you see? Has he ever? What does it mean? Who is she?" She counted the questions and made a note in the margin of her record, not an official notation, a personal one. The kind she made for herself, and then transcribed later into the interpretive notes that sat behind the formal record in the Ironvale archive. She wrote, "The room changed when he bowed. The room is still changing. The assembly was called to order by the king's herald, and Rhea watched through the gap in the partition as the alphas arranged themselves in the formal semicircle before the dais. Kaelin descended from his throne to stand at floor level, which was an unusual choice, one she noted carefully. Most kings received their subjects from above. Standing at floor level meant something. She had written enough diplomatic records to know that the physical language of these ceremonies communicated as much as the spoken words, and a king who came down from his dais was a king who wanted to be understood as among his people rather than above them, at least for the duration of this particular gathering. It was a studied choice. A political one. She wrote it down. She also noted that Aldrich did not join the formal semicircle. He stood slightly apart, near the left column, at an angle that kept both the king and the full sweep of the room in his peripheral vision. It was the position of a man who had attended enough of these gatherings to know where the danger would come from if it came, and had long since stopped pretending that ceremony was sufficient protection. She found herself wanting to ask him how many of these assemblies he had witnessed in 200 years, what the patterns looked like from that kind of vantage, what the same mistakes looked like cycling through different faces with different names across the generations. She recognized the wanting as a professional curiosity, the pure archival instinct to know what the oldest source in the room knew. She did not let herself think about the other wanting, the one that had flickered to life when she had found his eyes on her. That one she filed, carefully away in the section of herself she did not examine during working hours. The formal addresses began. One alpha after another rose and spoke, the ritual language of alliance renewal, the careful pledges, the polite assertions of continued loyalty that everyone in the room understood as a performance of stability rather than a genuine reaffirmation of it. Rhea wrote everything. She wrote the words that were said and the pauses between them, the moments where a face shifted and then corrected itself, the subtle repositionings of bodies that happened when a sensitive topic was approached. She wrote the address that Alpha Dorian gave, careful and correct and utterly without distinction, and noted in her margin that he had glanced at her twice in the middle of it, both times with the slightly pressed look of a man managing several things at once. She did not write about what she noticed when Kaelin looked at her from across the room, because that was not a thing that went in a formal record. But she noticed it. She noticed that he looked, and that the looking was not casual, and that his expression when he looked at her was the expression of a man who was revising something. Lady Mireille arrived late, which was itself a statement. Rhea had been dimly aware of her before the assembly, in the way one becomes aware of strong perfume in a closed space, an atmospheric pressure shift that required acknowledgement even before the source was identified. She had heard the name, of course. Everyone had heard the name. Lady Mireille of the Greyvale line was the presumptive future queen, the woman whose union with Kaelin had been in diplomatic negotiation for 3 years and was expected to be formalized at this very assembly. She was exactly what the political context required: ancient lineage, considerable beauty, the particular social intelligence that people in her position developed as a survival skill, and the kind of confidence that came from having never, once in her life, been required to prove herself in a room that did not already know exactly who she was. She entered through the side door that connected to the royal apartments, which meant she had access to that door, which meant more than it might seem. She wore silver gray, a deliberate echo of the king's standard, and her dark hair was arranged with the kind of studied elegance that took hours to make look effortless. 2 ladies accompanied her, slightly behind, the human equivalent of a frame. She moved through the room with the serene certainty of a woman who had already decided how every significant thing in it would resolve. And if there was a slight pause in her measured step when her eyes found Rhea behind the partition, it was brief enough that only someone trained to notice everything would have caught it. Rhea caught it. She wrote nothing about it in the record, but she catalogued it with the same care she gave to everything else. That small hesitation, that fractional recalibration behind Mireille's polished eyes, and she filed it alongside the other things she was collecting that had no formal category but felt important. The way Aldrich had spoken, the way Kaelin looked, the way Dorian wanted her contained, the way the room had changed. She was beginning to understand that something was happening that she did not have enough information to comprehend yet, and the absence of sufficient information was the single condition that Rhea found genuinely uncomfortable. She could manage fear. She could manage being ignored or dismissed or talked around as if she were furniture. She could manage cold rooms and long nights, and the particular loneliness of a person whose natural language was written rather than spoken. But not knowing, not having the full record, not being able to place the current moment accurately within the larger pattern that she could not manage. That was the thing that made her hands want to move faster across the parchment. The formal portion of the assembly concluded in the late afternoon, and the hall dissolved into the more fluid arrangements of the banquet that followed. Long tables had appeared as if by sorcery, laden with the kind of spread that communicated both abundance and discipline, wealth that knew how to restrain itself. Rhea ate a small plate of food standing near the scribe's table and watched the room rearrange itself into its informal hierarchies, the clusters that formed and reformed, the careful approaches and deliberate distances that mapped the real state of every alliance with far more honesty than any official address. She was watching a particularly interesting exchange between two of the Eastern Alphas when she became aware of a presence at her shoulder and turned to find Aldrich standing beside her. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the same exchange she had been observing, and for a moment, they both simply stood there watching it together. And the silence between them was not the silence of two people who did not know what to say, but the silence of two people who were currently doing the same thing and did not need to narrate it. "You were writing during the Eastern Alpha's addresses," he said, still not looking at her. "I watched your hand. You wrote more during the pauses than during the words." "The pauses carry more information," she said. Because it was true, and because there was no point in dissembling with a man who had apparently been reading rooms for 2 centuries. "Yes," he said, as if she had confirmed something. He was quiet for a moment. Then, still looking at the room rather than at her, "How long have you been Ironvale's archivist?" 4 years as primary, 8 years before that as secondary, 12 years in the archive." "Yes." "And before that?" She hesitated, a fraction. "I was in the general pack service, household work. Before that, the pack school briefly. I was removed from the academic track when I was 14, said it the way she always said things that had once hurt and had since become merely factual, with no particular inflection. Aldrich turned and looked at her then, and the weight of his regard was something she felt in her sternum. A pressure that was not unpleasant but was very, very serious. "Who removed you from the academic track?" "The Pack Council, on the grounds that my wolf had not presented and there was no evidence it would. They reallocated my scholarship slot to a student with a confirmed wolf." She kept her voice even. "It was a reasonable administrative decision given the available information." "The available information was wrong," Aldrich said, with a calm certainty that was not a comfort and was not intended to be one. It was simply a statement of fact from a man who had access to information she did not. "My wolf has never presented," she said carefully. "Your wolf has been waiting," he said. "There is a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. His face gave away nothing and everything at the same time, the face of someone who had long since passed the stage of being careful about what he revealed, because there was no longer anything to protect. "What do you know?" she said. "That I do not." "More than can be said in a banquet hall," he told her, and his eyes moved once, briefly, deliberately, toward the dais where Kaelin stood in conversation with 3 alphas, and then back to her face. "But less than you will know by the end of this assembly." He moved away after that, and Rhea stood alone with her plate and her thoughts, and the sensation that the archive of her own life had just been opened to a page she had not known existed. "What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below." She did not sleep well. The chamber she had been assigned was small and correct, appropriate for a pack scribe, with a narrow bed and a single candle and a window that looked out onto the inner courtyard where the night wolves ran their patrol loops. She lay awake listening to the rhythm of their paws on stone and tried to do what she always did with insufficient information: map the edges of what she knew clearly against the edges of what she did not, and identify the precise shape of the gap between them. She knew. Aldrich had knelt to her. Aldrich had never knelt to anyone. Aldrich had spoken to her with the air of someone confirming a long-held hypothesis. Aldrich had referenced her wolf as if its dormancy were a choice or a circumstance rather than a permanent condition. Dorian had wanted her contained. Kaelin had watched her with revising eyes. Mireille had hesitated. She did not know. Why? Any of it. She turned onto her side and stared at the candle flame until it blurred, and she thought about the founding records, the ones she had spent the better part of a decade cataloging, cross-referencing, annotating. She knew those records better than anyone living. She was reasonably certain of that. She had read every surviving document from the era of the Seven Pack's founding, every treaty, every ceremonial account, every bloodline notation. She had read about the first wolves, the 7 founders who had established the territories and the codes that still govern them, had read the accounts of their gifts and their lineages, and the way those lineages had dispersed through the generations, thinning and branching and occasionally converging in ways the genealogical records only partially tracked. She had read specifically about the 7th founder, the one who was also called the first archivist, the one whose gift had not been strength or speed, or the particular ferocity that made the other 6 famous, but something older and stranger, the ability to read the truth of a bloodline by contact with its records. The one who had created the archive tradition in the first place, who had said, in the only direct quote that survived from the founding era, that a pack's records were its memory, and its memory was its soul, and anyone who kept that memory faithfully was a guardian of something more important than territory. The one whose line had been thought to end 3 generations after the founding, because the gift had not manifested in any confirmed descendant, and the genealogical trail had gone cold. Rhea lay in the narrow bed and listened to the patrol wolves, and thought about the 7th founder. She thought about the gift she had always had for more. Records. The way she could hold the shape of an entire genealogical tree in her mind at once. The way old documents felt, when she handled them, like something almost alive, as if the words had weight and temperature and intention. She had always attributed this to training and temperament. She had always explained it as the natural result of spending 12 years with nothing to do but read. She thought about Aldrich saying, "Your wolf has been waiting." She thought about it for a long time. Then, she got up, lit a second candle, and opened her satchel, and began to write. She wrote, in her personal record rather than the official one, everything she had observed and heard and catalogued since the moment the great doors had opened. She wrote it all in the careful, precise language she used for everything, and when she reached the part about Aldrich's bow and his words and the conversation at the banquet, she stopped writing and read back what she had produced, and sat for a moment with the particular feeling of a person who has documented something that changes the document itself. Then she turned to a fresh page and began to write a different kind of notation, the kind she had never written about herself before. A lineage entry. Her own. She knew her parents' names. She knew her grandparents' names, though she had never met them. She knew that her family had been in Iron Vale's lower service for 3 generations, that her mother had been a seamstress, and her father a groundskeeper, that neither of them had exhibited any notable pack gifts, that neither of them had been able to tell her anything about the generations before her grandparents, because that information had simply not been preserved. Unpreserved, because not important. Not important, because low status. The logic of invisibility was self-reinforcing. The things that did not seem to matter were not recorded, and the things that were not recorded became as if they had not existed. But she was an archivist. She knew that gaps in a record did not mean an absence of history. They meant an interruption in documentation. She wrote what she knew, and left careful blank spaces for what she did not. And she looked at those blank spaces for a long time, and she thought, I should be looking at the founding records. The archive room was on the eastern side of the Crown Hall, accessible through a corridor that was unguarded during the night hours, because it contained documents rather than valuables, and because few people thought documents were worth guarding. Rhea thought this was one of the more profound miscalculations in the general history of power, but she had never been in a position to correct it. She dressed and took her candle and went. The archive room was magnificent in the way that mattered to no one but her. 3 walls of shelves, floor to ceiling, organized by era and territory and type, with the founding documents in the deep cases along the north wall, behind glass that fogged slightly with the temperature difference of the room. She knew this archive from her visits to the Crown Court over the years, had requested access each time and been granted it without difficulty, because no one at court had ever fully understood why anyone would want access to it. She had her key from the previous visit, which the Crown's archivist had never asked back, because she suspected the Crown's archivist had simply forgotten about her, which was, again, the kind of thing that was professionally useful even when it was personally deflating. She opened the founding case. She found the genealogical records. She began to read. She had read them before, many times in copies and transcriptions, but she had never read them here, in the originals, and there was a difference. She felt the difference the moment her fingers touched the edge of the oldest document, a sensation like pressing a hand against a wall, and feeling, faintly, through the stone, a heartbeat. She told herself, this was her imagination. Then she kept reading. The 7th Founder's line. Marin of the Silver Record, that was the name in the oldest documents, though later records referred to her only by the title, the Keeper. Marin's children, 4 of them. Their children. The branching of the line through 5 generations, clearly documented. Then the 6th generation, thinner, with a notation she had seen before in the copies, but had always glossed over because it was in the archaic script, rather than the standard record hand, a script she had learned only 2 years ago from a visiting scholar. She translated it now, slowly, in the candlelight, her finger tracing the letters. She had read it before as something like the line disperses into common folk, which had always seemed like a lapse in the records, an unusually dismissive notation for what was otherwise meticulous genealogical work. Now, reading the original archaic script rather than a transcribed approximation, she read it differently. The line enters quiet. The gift sleeps until a keeper is needed. She sat with that for a very long time. The gift sleeps until a keeper is needed. Not ends. Not disperses. Sleeps. She turned pages, following the line past where she had thought it went cold, and she found it, 3 more generations down, following a branch she had never properly traced, because the names had been ordinary names. Service names, the names of people who groundskeep and sew and do not appear in any records, except the ones that track who belongs to which household, in which pack. A grandmother's name, in a secondary notation that was easy to miss if you were not looking for it. In Iron Vale's service rolls. In a pack 3 territories away from where the founding line was supposed to have ended. Rhea set down the document. She picked up her candle. She held it steady with both hands, because if she held it with one, her hand would shake, and she was not prepared to let her hands shake. She heard the door. She turned, already knowing, in the way that she was beginning to recognize as something other than ordinary intuition, already knowing who it would be before the door opened. Kalen stood in the doorway with a candle of his own and no escort, which was either very trusting or very deliberate, and the expression on his face was the expression she had catalogued from across the throne hall and had filed under revising. He looked at her. He looked at the open founding case. He looked at the document on the table in front of her, and something in his face did something complicated that she could not immediately name. You could not sleep either, she said, because it was the true thing, and she had found, in the last several hours, that she was running out of patience for saying the merely polite thing. I sleep very little in general, he said, but tonight particularly not. He came into the room, and the door swung almost closed behind him, and he looked at the document again, and she watched him make the decision to stop doing the thing where he did not acknowledge what he could see. What have you found? Something that may require significant revisions to the Iron Vale archive, she said, as well as to my own understanding of my family history. Rhea, he said, and the way he said her name was different from the way anyone else said it. It had a texture to it, a weight, as if the word mattered to him in a way that names usually did not matter. Aldrich came to me after the banquet. He told me things. What things? Kaelin set his candle on the table across from hers. He did not sit. He stood and looked at her with those amber eyes and said, "He told me that your bloodline does not simply descend from Marin's line. He told me that you are the convergence point, that every branch of her line that survived past the 6th generation leads back to you. All of them. He has been tracking them for decades because that is the kind of thing Aldrich does with 200 years of living, and every thread leads to this generation, this pack, this woman." He stopped. Then, quieter. "You are not just descended from the Keeper. You are the Keeper. The full convergence of a line that has been waiting 7 generations for the right vessel." The silence in the archive room was the silence of a very old place acknowledging a very old thing. "My wolf has never presented," she said, not because she believed it anymore, but because she needed to hear what he would say. "Your wolf does not present the way other wolves do," Kaelin said, with a certainty that was not the certainty of someone repeating information, but the certainty of someone who had understood something in the hours since it was told to him, had turned it over and looked at it from every angle and arrived at a place of genuine conviction. "You do not shift. You do not run. That is not what the Keeper's gift looks like. Aldrich says the Keeper does not wear her wolf. She carries it. Here." And he touched, very briefly and without drama, the center of his own chest, and then dropped his hand and looked at her. She thought about the founding documents under her hands feeling like a heartbeat. She thought about 12 years of records that seemed to breathe when she touched them, seemed to yield their information with a willingness that other archivists envied and could never quite replicate. She thought about the genealogical tree she could hold in her mind. Entire. Every branch. Every name. Every gap. She thought about the notation in archaic script. The gift sleeps until a keeper is needed. "What is a keeper needed for?" she said. Kaelin looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression changed, shifted from the revising look to something more direct, more personal, something that was only partially about politics and bloodlines, and the particular crisis that she was beginning to understand was the reason for this assembly. "There is a document missing from this archive," he said. "There has been for 40 years. The original compact of the 7 founders, the agreement that legally established the territories, the hierarchy, the conditions under which the Iron Crown exercises authority over the allied packs. Without it, 3 of the Eastern Alphas are preparing to claim that the current territorial boundaries are void, that the Crown's authority over their lands is based on a tradition, rather than a binding agreement, and can, therefore, be dissolved by a simple majority of the Pack Council. That would dissolve the 7 territories," Rhea said slowly. "It would dissolve them or reshape them so completely as to mean the same thing. It would mean war most likely, not immediately but within a generation." He did not look away from her. The document was not stolen in the ordinary sense. It was not taken by an enemy. Someone within the Crown's own court removed it 40 years ago, because they understood that the compact contains provisions that would have been very inconvenient for certain political arrangements at the time. He stopped. "The Crown's archivists have searched for 40 years. They cannot find it. Because they are looking for a document," Rhea said. And she felt, as she said it, the thing that Aldrich had been looking at when he had looked at her. The thing she had been trying to name since the moment she had first felt it. It was not power in the sense she would have expected. Not strength or heat or the surge of something physical. It was clarity. The extraordinary, terrible clarity of a person who suddenly has access to the full record. But a document is just the physical form of an agreement. The agreement itself is not lost. It is remembered. By the land. By the stones. By the oldest blood that was present when it was made. She pressed her hand flat against the founding case, the full surface of her palm against the old wood, and she closed her eyes, and she listened. This was the part she could not explain later in terms that satisfied anyone who had not experienced it, who had not felt it. What she felt was not mystical in the sense of being vague or dreamy. It was intensely specific. It was the exact sensation she had always had when she handled old documents, the sense of weight and temperature and intention, but amplified to a degree that made all her previous experiences feel like reading a single sentence from a book she had previously only held. She felt the archive around her in the way she felt the rooms she had always worked in, as spaces with memory, as containers of record, and the archive spoke back to her in the only language she had ever fully trusted, the language of precise, documented truth. She knew where the document was. She opened her eyes and looked at Kaylin, who had not moved, who was watching her with the expression of a man who has been waiting 11 years for a specific thing to happen and is not entirely certain even now that he is actually seeing it. "It is behind the east wall," she said. "Second panel from the northern corner. Someone built it into the wall, sealed it in a copper case. 40 years ago, this wall was renovated. Whoever hid it used the renovation as cover." She took her hand off the case. Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. Everything felt very, very clear. "You will need a mallet." Kaylin looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he turned and walked to the door, and opened it and said something in a low voice to the guard who apparently had been stationed there after all, further down the corridor than she had noticed, and she heard footsteps retreating quickly. He came back into the archive and stood across the table from her, and looked at her with those amber eyes. And the silence between them was different from any silence she had experienced before in her life. It was the silence of something that had arrived. "Aldrich also told me," Kaylin said, carefully, "that the convergence of the Keeper's line is not only significant for the archive." He stopped, and she could see him choosing his words, with the precision of a man who knew that what he was about to say could not be unsaid. "He told me that the Keeper's bond, when it awakens, is a founding bond. The kind that was present at the beginning of all 7 territories. The kind that does not recognize political arrangements or diplomatic negotiations, or the preferences of advisors. He paused. The kind that does not care about Lady Mireille." Rhea stood very still. "You have been negotiating with Greyvale for 3 years. "I have been managing a political situation for 3 years," he said. "I have not been negotiating my own future." He looked at her with total directness. The kind that cost something. She could see it costing him. "I looked at you this morning when you crossed the hall, and I felt something that I did not have a name for. I have been looking at you since, then trying to find the name for it. Aldrich saved me the trouble." She should say something careful. She should say something that acknowledged the complexity, the implications, the significant number of things that would need to be rearranged if what he was implying was true, and if she was prepared to accept it. She should probably say something about the founding bond being a very old concept that may have been metaphorical in the original texts, and that she would want to examine the primary sources carefully before drawing any definitive conclusions. She said, "I have been invisible for 31 years. "I know," he said. And the way he said it was not a dismissal and was not a comfort. It was an accounting. A clear-eyed acknowledgement of a wrong that had been done, not by him, but by a world that had consistently failed to see what was standing in front of it. "I am sorry for every year of it." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at him the way she looked at old documents, with the full attention of someone who needed to understand what she was actually reading, rather than what she expected to find. She saw a man who was genuinely trying. A man who had already begun to revise. A man who looked at her and did not look away, which she was understanding, slowly, was one of the rarest things anyone had ever offered her. "The compact first," she said. "Then everything else." His mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the expression that comes just before a smile when a person realizes that the thing they needed most is standing in front of them and is exactly what they hoped it would be. "Agreed," he said. "If you want to see how this story ends, Make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. The mallet arrived within 20 minutes, carried by a bewildered junior guard who had clearly been told do not ask questions and had wisely chosen not to. Kaylin took it and looked at Rhea, and she led him to the east wall and pointed to the second panel from the northern corner, and he looked at the wall for a moment with the expression of a man committing, and then he swung the mallet. The panel was solid but not structural, a facing layer rather than load-bearing stone, and it cracked on the third swing, revealing the hollow space behind it. And in the hollow space, exactly as she had said, a copper case, tarnished to near black, sealed with a wax that had hardened to a brittle shell, but intact. Completely, improbably, impossibly intact. Rhea knelt and lifted it with both hands, and the sensation was enormous, not painful but profound, the way standing at the edge of very high ground is profound, the awareness of scale, of the distance between where you are standing and everything below. She set it on the table and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at Kaylin. "Open it," she said. He broke the wax seal carefully, running a thumbnail along the edge, and lifted the lid. Inside, folded in oilskin that had done exactly the job it was designed to do, was a document. Old. Very old. The kind of old that Rhea had spent her entire career learning to handle, and she reached in with the automatic care of a person for whom old things were sacred, and she unfolded the oilskin, and she unfolded the document. The compact of the 7 founders. All 7 signatures. All 7 seals. Complete. Undamaged. Rhea read the first line in the archaic script, and the modern translation arrived in her mind. Simultaneously, naturally, without effort, the way the truth of a record arrived when she was fully present with it. She read the full compact in a state of extraordinary silence, not the silence of holding her breath, but the silence of being entirely still inside herself. And when she finished, she looked up at Kaylin and said, "The Eastern Alpha's claim is not only incorrect. The compact contains a provision specifically anticipating an attempt to void it. Any Alpha who publicly declares the compact void and then is shown the original document forfeits their territorial claim entirely." Kaylin looked at her. "They do not know that." "No, they do not. Because no one has read the full document in 40 years. She carefully refolded it in its oilskin. They will know it tomorrow." He was watching her with the amber eyes, and she was watching him, and the archive room was full of candlelight and the particular quiet of a very important thing having just happened. And she thought, 31 years. 31 years of standing at the edge of rooms. 31 years of making herself small enough to be useful and invisible enough to be safe. She was tired of the edge of rooms. "You said the founding bond does not care about Lady Mireille," she said. "I said that, yes. And you are the king." "I am. And if the founding bond has awakened, then there are provisions in the compact itself regarding the recognition of the keeper." She looked at the document under her hands. "I know, because I just read them. The keeper of the compact is owed formal recognition by the Iron Crown. It is not optional. It is written." He looked at her, and the almost smile was back, deeper this time. "It is written," he agreed. "Then it must be honored." She thought about her wolf. She thought about Aldrich saying, "Your wolf has been waiting." She thought about the warmth that had been building in her chest since the moment his eyes had found hers across the banquet table, which she recognized now for what it was, had recognized it since his words in the archive corridor, even if she had not let herself name it. The bond settling into certainty, the way a document settles into its correct archive place, the particular click of something that has been out of order finding its home. She felt her wolf then, for the first time, not as a shift or a surge, or the physical transformation she had always assumed she lacked. She felt it as a presence, deep and old and vast, a silver thing that filled the space behind her sternum and looked out through her eyes with the calm authority of something that had always known this moment was coming and had simply been patient enough to wait for it. She felt it recognize Kaelin, the way old blood recognizes old blood, the way founding recognizes founding, with a certainty that preceded language and outlasted politics. Kaelin felt it too. She could see it in his face, the amber of his eyes deepening, the particular stillness of a wolf that has found what it was looking for after a very long time of looking. "There it is," he said softly. "There it is," she agreed. Morning came the way important mornings come, with the same sun as every other morning, the same quality of light through the archive room's high windows, and yet with a different weight to it, as if the day itself was aware of what it was required to carry. Rhea had not slept. She had spent the remaining hours of the night reading the compact in full, 3 times, until she knew it with the same intimacy she knew every document she had spent extended time with, until it was not just data, but understanding. She had also written 12 pages of personal notation, which she knew would need to be organized into a proper record eventually, and which for now served the essential purpose of externalizing the interior landscape that had been thoroughly rearranged in the last 18 hours. Kaelin had stayed. This was a fact she was still processing. He had sat across the archive table from her with documents of his own, and they had worked in the particular companionable silence of 2 people who are comfortable thinking in each other's presence. And occasionally one of them had said something about what they were reading, and the other had responded, and it had been the most natural thing she had experienced in 31 years of living, which said something about 31 years of living that she was not yet ready to say out loud. The assembly convened again after breakfast. Rhea arrived at the scribe's table with the compact in its oilskin case and her personal record and the notes she had made, and she set them on the table and arranged her materials with the usual precision. And she sat down, and she looked at the room. She saw it differently now. She always saw rooms as spaces full of information, but now she saw it with the additional layer that the keeper's gift apparently added to everything. The sense of the record beneath the surface, the pattern beneath the arrangement. She saw the 3 Eastern Alphas positioned close together with the body language of people who had already decided on a course of action, and were waiting only for the appropriate moment to execute it. She saw Lady Mireille arrive, and take her position near the royal dais, with the slightly too careful composure of someone who had heard, or suspected, something overnight that had not yet been confirmed. She saw Aldrich in his usual place by the left column, and when his gray eyes found hers across the room, he did not bow again. He simply looked at her with the expression of a man whose long-running calculation had finally produced its expected result. Alpha Dorian appeared at her shoulder. "You look different," he said. "I slept poorly," she said. "You look," he said, and stopped, and tried again. "You look the way the records look, after you have spent time with them. Like something has been read." He was watching her with the uncertain expression she recognized from yesterday, but it was less alarmed now, more resigned. "Rhea, what has happened?" "I will explain after the assembly," she told him. "The information will be significantly easier to receive when the political situation has been stabilized." He stared at her. "What does that mean?" "It means please trust me for the next hour," she said, and picked up her quill. The assembly opened with the formal renewal of the territorial pledges, same as the day before, and Rhea wrote and waited. The Eastern Alphas waited also. She could feel it in the room, the coiled quality of a plan about to be executed. She had counted the moments since she found the document, had felt through the night the absolute certainty of what the compact said and what it meant, and she was calm in a way she had not expected to be. A deep structural calm, the calm of a person who has the full record. Alpha Brennan of the Eastern Reaches rose when the formal pledges were complete. He was a large man, deliberate in his movements, with the manner of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times and was now performing it with the confidence of a person who believes they know exactly how it will resolve. "My lords," he said, and his voice carried the particular resonance of a prepared speech. I must raise, with the greatest respect to the Iron Crown and to all present, the matter of the foundational legal standing of our territorial compact. The room became very quiet. It is the position of the Eastern Alliance, Brennan continued, that in the absence of the original founding compact, a document which has been missing from the Crown's archive for 4 decades and which forms the only binding legal basis for the current territorial arrangement, the boundaries established by that compact cannot be enforced. We submit that the Iron Crown's authority over the Eastern Territories is therefore based on tradition rather than binding agreement, and we call for a council vote on the matter of territorial reassignment. The silence that followed was the silence of a very large room containing 200 people, all of whom had just heard something that meant one thing and were calculating what it meant for them specifically. Rhea set down her quill. She rose from the scribe's table. This was not in anyone's plan. She could feel it in the quality of the attention that swung toward her, the slight confusion of a room adjusting to an unexpected variable. Alpha Dorian made a small sound beside her that was not quite a word. She walked from the scribe's table to the floor of the assembly, which was not a space she had any formal right to occupy, and she stood in the center of the obsidian floor and felt the eyes of the room on her, felt it differently than she had ever felt anything, because now she was not standing in a room that did not see her. The room saw her completely, and she was finally prepared to be seen. She held up the copper case. The compact. Of the 7 founders, she said, and her voice was steady and clear, and carried in the way that her voice had never previously been required to carry. Has not been missing. It has been waiting to be found. She set the case on the nearest table and lifted out the document in its oilskin. I am Rhea of Ironvale. I am the keeper of the record, by right of blood and by right of the compact's own provisions, which I have read in full and which I will now make available for the examination of every alpha in this hall. She looked at Brennan directly, without hostility and without apology. The compact contains a provision anticipating exactly the challenge you have made, Alpha Brennan. I recommend you read it before deciding how to proceed. Brennan's face had gone through several changes very rapidly. He looked at the document. He looked at Rhea. He looked at Kaylin, who was standing at the floor level as he had the day before, and whose expression was the expression of a man who had expected this outcome and found it exactly as satisfying as he had anticipated. That document, Brennan said carefully, requires verification. It will receive full verification, Rhea said, by the Crown's archivists and by any independent witnesses the Assembly chooses to name. I will facilitate that process. I am, she said. And this was the part that still sat strangely in her mouth, the part she was still learning how to say, somewhat qualified for it. Aldrich made a sound from his position by the column. It was a very small sound, and it may have been a laugh. The verification took 4 hours. Rhea sat at the center table and guided 4 archivists and 2 independent scholars through the document, answered every question about provenance and condition, explained the archaic script passages that required translation, and at the end of 4 hours, there was no one in the hall who had any remaining grounds for doubt about the document's authenticity. The Eastern Alliance conferred in urgent whispers in the corner. The provision regarding forfeiture was pointed out to them, quietly, by one of Kaylin's advisors. The conference became less urgent and more resigned. It was while she was organizing the verification documentation that Mireille came to her. She had seen it coming. Mireille had been watching her all afternoon with the calculating composure that Rhea now recognized as the active intelligence of a woman who was very good at reading changing situations and very practiced at managing them. She came without her ladies, which was itself a statement, and she sat in the chair across the table from Rhea and looked at her with eyes that were dark and clear and entirely without pretense. You know what this means, Mireille said, not accusing, almost curious, the tone of a woman who was doing her own accounting. I have some understanding of it, yes, Rhea said, Mireille was quiet for a moment. I have been preparing to be queen for a very long time, she said. I am good at it. I would have been effective. She said this without bitterness and without self-pity, as a simple, accurate statement, the way Ria said things that had once hurt and had since become merely factual. I believe that completely, Ria said, and meant it. Mireille looked at her for another moment. The founding bond, she said, is not something that was in any of my preparation. It was not in mine either, Ria said. Something passed across Mireille's face, brief and human and very honest. No, she said. I imagine it was not. She was quiet for another moment. Then she straightened, and the composure came back. But it was a different composure, one with more room in it, less armor and more architecture. The Greyvale line has been allied with the Iron Crown for 4 generations, she said. I would not see that alliance ended. Nor would I, Ria said. A formal alliance of friendship and mutual support between Greyvale and the Iron Crown is, if I am reading the political landscape correctly, in everyone's interest, including the Keepers. Mireille looked at her with an expression that was not warm and was not cold, that was something more interesting than either. Respect of the kind that is paid between 2 people who see each other clearly and find the seeing adequate. You are not what I expected, she said. I am what the records say I am, Ria replied. It is only that no one had read those records carefully enough. Mireille rose. She was, Ria thought, genuinely magnificent in the way that very well-made things were magnificent, completely what they were intended to be. She inclined her head, a gesture that was not submission and was not concession, but was acknowledgement, and moved away, and her ladies materialized from somewhere and flanked her. And Ria watched her go and thought, the record will say she departed with dignity, because she did. She thought, I will write it down. The formal recognition happened at dusk, because Kaelin was a man who understood that timing was part of meaning, and dusk had been the hour of founding ceremonies since the beginning of the 7 territories. The hall was lit with far more torches than it had held during the day sessions, the walls warm with shifting amber light, and every alpha and every significant court member was present, arrayed in the formal semicircle with a solemnity that was not performed but genuine, the weight of something old being formally acknowledged. Ria stood in the center of the obsidian floor and felt the wolf steady and silver in her chest, and she did not stand at the edge of the room. She stood in the middle of it, and she looked straight ahead, and she was not invisible. Kaelin stood before her. He was in formal ceremonial dress, the dark and silver of the Iron Crown, and he looked at her with the amber eyes and held the compact of the 7 founders in his hands and said, in the old language first, and then in the common tongue so, that everyone would understand. By the right of the original compact, by the provision of the 7th founder, and by the founding bond which has awakened in this generation, I recognize Ria of Ironvale as keeper of the record and first advisor to the Iron Crown, with all the rights, protections, and honors that the founders of the 7 territories determined to be her due. He had added, on his own, the title First Advisor. She had not expected that. She looked at him and saw the deliberateness of it, the statement it made to the room about the nature of what he was recognizing. Not just the historical gift, but the person who carried it. The full recognition of a woman who had spent 31 years being unseen and was now being placed explicitly in the center of the record. Aldrich came forward then, and he stood before her, and he went to one knee again as he had in the morning, but this time the room had context for it, and the silence that followed was not the silence of shock, but the silence of understanding. 200 people standing in the amber light of the founding hall and grasping, each in their own way, the weight of what they were witnessing. First among all who are loyal to the compact, Aldrich said, in his quiet, room-filling voice, I recognize the keeper. He rose, He looked at her with his gray eyes. "It has been a long wait," he said, and there was something in it that was not quite apology and not quite pride, something more complex than either. The feeling of a very long vigil finally released. "Yes," she said simply. "It has." Kaelin extended his hand, and she looked at it for a moment. The open palm, the amber eyes above it, the founding bond warm and certain between them. And she thought of 12 years in an archive, of a scholarship reallocated, of standing at the edges of rooms, of records that breathed under her hands, and a wolf that had been patient for so long. She thought of Aldrich's words, "Your wolf has been waiting." She thought of the notation in archaic script, "The gift sleeps until a keeper is needed." She placed her hand in his. The bond settled into its permanent form, the way the most important things settle. Not with drama, not with thunder, but with the quiet, definitive quality of a key turning in a lock that has been waiting for it. She felt it in the wolf, the silver presence widening and deepening, and she felt it in Kaelin's hand, the warmth of it, the certainty, the recognition that moved through him and into her and completed a circuit that had been open for 7 generations. The hall witnessed it. She did not look at the hall. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and in his amber eyes she saw the same thing she felt, the extraordinary relief of something that has been unfinished finally being whole. "There is a great deal to do," she said. "There is," he agreed. "Where do you suggest we start?" "The Eastern Territorial provisions need to be recopied in the current. Hand and redistributed to all PAC archivists," she said. "And then we need to find whoever removed the document from this archive 40 years ago. The record of that is incomplete, and I do not leave records incomplete." He laughed. She had not heard him laugh before. It was a good sound, unguarded and real. The laugh of a man who had not expected delight and was finding it anyway. "No," he said. "I do not imagine you do." Aldrich stood nearby, and she heard him make that small sound again, the one that might be a laugh, and she thought, 200 years of living, and he comes to assemblies alone, stands at the edge of halls, waits for something he has calculated is coming. She thought, when this is all settled, when the records are in order and the Eastern Territories have been reminded of the provisions they signed and the archive has been properly restored and the compact has been secured in a case that does not require a mallet to access, she wants to sit with Aldrich and ask him. Everything. All of it. The full record of 200 years. The patterns that repeat and the ones that do not. The view from that kind of vantage. She wants to write it all down. She was still holding Kaelin's hand. She noticed this with a small internal acknowledgement of the newness of it, the sensation of not immediately recalibrating to invisible, of being held in the center of a room by the hand of a man who had revised his entire understanding of his own future, because a wolf he did not. No had bowed in a throne hall, and something in him had responded to a woman he had never seen before, with the bone-deep certainty of the founding bond. She thought, I have read enough records to know that this is the part of the story that the official accounts will reduce to a single formal line. She thought, I am going to write the real version. Outside the hall, the iron moon was rising, the great silver disk that the founding records said appeared on the night of significant moments. The moon that had risen on the night the original compact was signed, that rose, according to various historical accounts, at births and deaths, and recognitions of the kind that changed the shape of things permanently. She could see it through the high windows, climbing over the battlements, casting the obsidian floor in silver. She had read about the iron moon in records. She had always thought of it as historical, as a thing that had happened to other people in other times. But she was learning. Tonight, in a hall full of amber torchlight and 200 witnesses, that history was not other people in other times. History was this. A woman who had spent 31 years at the edges of rooms standing in the center of one. A wolf that had waited patiently for 7 generations finally being given its name. A document restored to its case. A bond acknowledged. A record completed. She was the keeper. She had always been the keeper. She had simply needed the room to be ready to see it, and the room had finally, at last, looked up from its own noise and understood what had been standing quietly in its archive, handling its oldest documents with both hands, writing down everything it missed. She was 31 years old, and she had never been seen, and now she was the most seen person in the 7 territories. And it felt, she decided, exactly the way the founding records had always made it sound. Not like triumph, though there was that. Not like vindication, though there was that. Too. It felt like the moment when a very long calculation resolves, and the answer is exactly what you suspected it would be, and you set down your quill, and you close the document, and you let yourself, finally, be in the present moment, rather than in the record of it. Kaylin squeezed her hand. She looked at him. "Are you all right?" he asked, quietly enough that it was only for her. "Yes," she said, and meant it completely. "I am, for the first time in my life, exactly where the record says I am supposed to be." If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?